Thank you, Gustav, and good morning. I've always come to realize that talking about sport in Stellenbosch can be a dangerous business. About a couple of months ago, I did what I thought was quite an innocent article on Dani Craven, the sports icon of Stellenbosch. And I thought it was quite a balanced article. It was published in the Burger, the Afrikaans newspaper in the Western Cape. And I didn't expect that kind of antagonism that this article attracted. Because what I did say was that Craven might have been a good sports person and a good coach, etc., but he had little understanding of the complexities of politics. So the riposte and the response to that was that I knew nothing about sport and that I'm an incomer in Stellenbosch, I'm a Jimmy come lately, and that also that I never played rugby. That was the deepest cut of them all. Yeah. So talking about sport here can be a dangerous business. What I'll try to do today is just to isolate what I regard as some key issues pertaining to the writing on sport, specifically the history of sport in South Africa. It took a while for sports history to take off. You've got to realize that it didn't just fall out of the sky. It had to compete with other dimensions of South African history, and which dominated the historiographical landscape at the time. Afrikaner politics and its historical antecedents, black resistance movements and their origins, and of course apartheid itself and its many ramifications. So it had to jostle to get a place in terms of these thematic preferences. It also had to differentiate itself sharply from ever popular books about the history of sport, particularly of the biographical kind. It always amazes me, sports people, when they're 30 years old, somebody manages to write a biography of them. I'm more than 60 years old and nobody's even thought about doing that. But then you know what kind of sports person I was. So all those kinds of popular books, and they are popular, because else the publishers won't just publish it. So you've got to make sure that what you write is quite different from, it's got an academic content to it. Now, it fell to some early academic pioneers to try and elevate the history of sport and to show that it's worthy of a place in the academic market, particularly if you're being accused, which happened at times, that sports historians are just fans with typewriters, practicing their esoteric craft with little contact with the historical mainstream. I remember I was at University of South Africa for a long time, and I started developing an interest in sports history even then. But then I was told that, you actually got to up your game, figuratively, because sport is you just read about sport in the newspaper the day after the Bulls played at Loftus. Now you want to come and tell us this is a serious enterprise. I didn't take kindly to that, and since then I've really tried to present sports history as a legitimate enterprise in terms of what one can call deep politics. Now, what I regard here as deep politics is quite different from the normal kind of anti-apartheid material and pro-apartheid arguments, where the study of history, it is just exchanges between these various antagonistic groups. I regard deep politics as something which social traditions and attitudes are expressed through recreational practices. Tony Collins, who is a well-known British author of the history of rugby, has reminded us that all sports history that have mass appeal reflect the interests and the prejudices of those sections of society that nurture them. Now it's for the sports historian then to ferret out those meanings. And you can't just assume them, they've got to be proven. So this can be quite a rigorous exercise. Sports, the Social History Project and Sports History. Here I've got to take you back to the development of sports history, because that's from the framework of sports history that, from social history that sports history emanated. There are certain distinct trends in South African historiography. Initially, that of an Afrikaner interpretation, which foregrounded nationalistic interests, and then a liberal version, usually emanating from white English speakers who emphasized the wrong turnings, and which was premised upon notions of individual agency within a free market economy, and through to an oppositional new Marxist frame, which included a strong social history tradition, with its emphasis on the material underpinnings of society. Within such a stark characterization, there are, of course, many overlaps and nuances. It was particularly the history workshop, which was very popular in the 80s and early 90s at WITS, which promoted the idea of social history and which featured, as far as I know, the first papers on sport within that context. That was done by Jeff Perris, the noted historian of Xhosa history, and Tim Cousins on soccer, and Jeff did a paper, one of the first papers on black history in South Africa. Now, this did give sports history a certain clout, with eminent scholars like Jeff and Tim writing on sport. Now, what does one try to achieve in a nutshell? Overall, at bedrock, the main thrust is to grasp, and almost simultaneously, the manifestations of large and abstract structures, as well as the small details of life, recapturing people's experience and understanding the multiple grids which mediate these. So, you've got to make your fishes talk like whales, without putting it as bluntly as that. Now, all of this is valid, but it's also important that one has to realize it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it's got to be grounded in the prevailing realities of life. In current South Africa, the professionalization of sport has helped to shape a reality where class considerations, as much as race, help to shape the sporting environment. That brings me to the determinants of race and class. There's been a considerable number of books and articles looking at race in South African context, which is understandable. There have been fewer who've looked at the effect of capitalism, the effect of market forces on the shaping of sport. But that is always what I regard as the hidden dimension. For example, it was only once Afrikaners become financially relatively prosperous during the 1960s that they took to cricket in greater numbers and began to assert themselves on the pitch during the ensuing decades. Cricket was also always seen as an upper-class game, which took a lot of time and money, and Afrikaner schools only afforded cricket fields later in the 60s. Historically, black cricketers, with some exceptions, are likewise the products of a class-orientated system. During the late 19th century and for most of the 20th century, a tiny sliver of an emerging black middle class slowly moved up on the slippery class ladder, with cricket being a culturally constituent expression as part of a patient quest for wider recognition. This changed, of course, rapidly after the post-apartheid South Africa. Now, although there may be varying emphasis on social sports history, at the core of it, the omission or neglect of material conditions is likely to have an attenuating overall effect. There are also other related challenges. In using class as an analytical tool, it cannot be restricted, for example, only to the aspiring black middle class. We took to cricket, for example, as it leaves the great swath of underclasses untouched and marooned, far removed from the organised mainline sport. Focusing on the cultured class and foregrounding that segment of black sports people by writing them back into history can, of course, fill important gaps in coming to a fuller understanding of South African sport and society. Yet there are also limitations. As far as black communities at large are concerned, it can only be a partial recovery, as too much is just left uncounted and unaccounted for in terms of explaining preferences, apathy, or rejection of sporting codes. Ideally, such silences should be interrogated. Similarly, in terms of rugby, it can be argued that elite players tend to come from a handful of top schools, and academically we still know relatively little about the dynamics of rugby culture in the South African hinterland and the impact of commercialization. Now, what are the challenges ahead? It's often said in terms of sports history that in fairly homogeneous ethnic societies that it has heroic and dimensional, mythical dimensions and can be viewed as a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Now, in South Africa, of course, with so many contending factions, it's particularly difficult to construct a narrative of ourselves. Now, well aware of this, the social history paradigm has located its subject at the juncture of such cross-cutting influences. So, there's been awareness of the multiplicity of interest in South Africa. But this does not imply that everybody is abided by that, and one still finds a number of books or a number of articles that just carry on in a kind of political and empirical manner without due reflection upon the context in which their work is being catapulted. This doesn't mean that sports history has been left untouched. There has been shots across the bow claiming that it only fixates on antagonisms within the sports context, and that historical actors can be reduced to abstract categories with no or little regard for them as living agents and effective beings. It's particularly under the influence of postmodernism that these ideas have emerged. It's been said that historical knowledge and understanding are not acquired exclusively as an empiricist exercise, but rather being generated by the nature of representation and aesthetic decisions by the historian. Now, I don't want to get into the whole postmodernist debate, but it does alert one to certain new ways of looking at sports history, particularly the representation of sporting experiences. Here, for example, one can look at a book which I read some while ago, Errol Tobias, which it's got so many layers to it. And he's been one of the first black Springboks, and he's been denigrated because he played so-called white rugby. But one also learns a lot about how he experienced that. And there are other experiences of players who've been excommunicated from amateur rugby in the 80s because they played in the professional leagues in England. And that goes not only for white players, but also for black players, as Hendrik Snyders has shown. Also, the nature of fandom has really been untouched. I recently co-authored a paper on why so-called coloured people in the Western Cape support the All Black national team. And that led me to a number of what I regard as interesting and intriguing conclusions. Furthermore, there are what one has got to bear in mind is a nostalgic effect of sport. And one finds this on the back pages of the Afrikaans newspapers, and not only Afrikaans newspapers, where heroes of yesteryear are being elevated to new positions of power and influence and of cultural expression. Now, that in itself is interesting. That's a kind of nostalgic influence which are being cosseted at this particular juncture in South African history. So one has got to interrogate that and say, what is the purpose does it serve to have these heroes of yesteryear being foregrounded again? And what is this backstory to that? Overall, sports history, as Gustav has said, his introduction, is well established. Although there are a relatively small number of practitioners, this genre, though, still awaits, as has happened elsewhere, the kind of clashes sparked in part by generational tensions as younger cohort of scholars take the field. Now, we still await a kind of full-blown Africanist attack on paradigms or incorporate gender dimensions to a greater extent. And I'm looking forward to those kind of clashes. Thank you very much.